Thank you, March, for this beautiful month. Gratitude, March, for new opportunities.
Thank you, March, for fresh beginnings. Gratitude, March, for days filled with happiness.
Thank you, March, for your good energy. Gratitude, March, for peace in every day.
Thank you, March, for growing progress. Gratitude, March, for good news on the way.
Thank you, March, for good health.
Gratitude, March, for a peaceful mind.
Thank you, March, for new hopes.
Gratitude, March, for the path of success.
Thank you, March, for the smile of each day. Gratitude, March, for positive thinking.
Thank you, March, for my family's happiness. Gratitude, March, for peace at home.
Thank you, March, for increasing wealth. Gratitude, March, for new work. Thank you, March, for good people coming my way. Gratitude, March, for good times.
Thank you, March, for daily blessings. Gratitude, March, for God's grace. Thank you, March, for constant progress. Gratitude, March, for every good opportunity.
Thank you, March, for mental strength. Gratitude, March, for confidence. Thank you, March, for new achievements. Gratitude, March, for wise decisions.
Thank you, March, for rising income. Gratitude, March, for abundance. Thank you, March, for a happy life. Gratitude, March, for good thoughts.
Thank you, March, for new beginnings. Gratitude, March, for daily inspiration.
Thank you, March, for success at work. Gratitude, March, for the right path.
Thank you, March, for good health. Gratitude, March, for a strong body.
Thank you, March, for a joyful mind. Gratitude, March, for peace in the heart.
Thank you, March, for auspicious days. Gratitude, March, for good results.
Thank you, March, for growing faith. Gratitude, March, for every victory.
Thank you, March, for good relationships. Gratitude, March, for love and respect. Thank you, March, for new lessons. Gratitude, March, for the strength to move ahead.
Thank you, March, for every success. Gratitude, March, for every chance. Thank you, March, for prosperity. Gratitude, March, for every happiness.
Thank you, March, for the beauty of life. Gratitude, March, for good fortune.
Thank you, March, for growth at work. Gratitude, March, for new pathways.
Thank you, March, for good thoughts. Gratitude, March, for positive energy. Thank you, March, for daily growth. Gratitude, March, for small miracles.
Thank you, March, for abundance. Gratitude, March, for a joyful future.
Thank you, March, for divine blessings. Gratitude, March, for every good change.
Thank you, March, for new joys. Gratitude, March, for the simplicity of life.
Thank you, March, for stable mind. Gratitude, March, for good news.
Thank you, March, for complete success. Gratitude, March, for endless happiness.